All right. So on today's show, we are excited to have Carin Mrotz, the outgoing executive director at Jewish Community Action. She will chat with us about some of the ways JCA and the Jewish community have been involved with reimagining community safety beyond policing. I'm really excited for this conversation, Carin, and welcome to Kumba Hineni, a podcast on intersectionality more than just skin deep. Welcome.
Thanks, Enzi. I'm excited to be on your podcast.
I am excited to have you on the podcast as well. And I will just say this. For some reason, I'm actually really nervous about this podcast with you, but it'll be great and amazing. So the first question I actually wanted.
You'll be nervous. I feel like, am I the person who's been on your podcast who you've actually known the longest, or
Yes.
no? Yeah.
Yes. That's part of where it's coming from. But so really, the first question is really just wanted to hear from you the ways in which Jewish Community Action, but really the Jewish community, have been involved in this conversation of community safety. I really think back to even early on after the murder of Jamar Clark and the ways in which I was really heartwarmed by the ways in which Jewish Community Action was involved. And it gave me a sense of hope for our community in the Twin Cities. So I would love to hear a little bit about what that was like, as well as why it has been important to you for the Jewish community, but also for JCA to be involved in this community safety conversation.
Sure. Okay, lots of questions. I'll just start with why JCA as an organization has been in the space and tried to bring more of the Jewish community into the space around community safety. And I'll also go back to Jamar Clark at the end of, I want to say, 2015. So Jewish Community Action organizes Jews for racial and economic justice, and that has often looked like campaigns for things like affordable housing and criminal justice reform and immigrant rights. And so we were always operating in the space of how is the criminal justice system discriminating against people, harming people, and we were always working on things like sentencing reform. And so I think it's like a pretty logical extension to start talking about police violence and policing as a system of harm. And I will say, for me personally, as a staff person at JCA, for me, the response that JCA undertook after the police killed Jamar Clark was also a moment of just, it was meaningful personally to me. And it was probably one of the things that made me more invested in being JCA's next leader, because it was also a moment where I saw the community really show up in a way that felt powerful. You know this, Enzi, because we live a few blocks apart, but I live on the north side. And so I knew about the police having killed Jamar Clark within about an hour or two of it happening, just from text threads, just Northsider stuff. And so it was relatively natural to say, I work for this organization that is fighting for the rights of incarcerated people and the families of incarcerated people. And it would be a natural space for us to show up and be supportive here after the police have killed this young guy. There was also just a tremendously big, organized faith response that JCA participated in. We were constantly with anti-racist pastors and imams. And so there was a pretty tremendously well-organized faith response. And I was very happy that JCA had a home there in that organized faith response. And then we saw the community show up again. I mean, it's the awful thing is that we have continued evidence of our community's willingness and desire to show up because we have continued police killings, right? Mm-hmm. And so whether it was Philando Castile or Thurman Blevins, which was a few blocks away from the home of one of our organizers at the time, or more recently, George Floyd, we've seen the community continue to want to show up in solidarity and in response after this happens. And so for us, that has become a bigger conversation about what are we doing in the meantime? How are we engaging meaningfully, not just in what some might consider police reform, but I don't even want to say alternatives to police, but just other ways that communities are keeping each other safe. Some that our community has a tremendous history of doing. Our community's had its own forms of community safety. I mean, for centuries,
Mhm.
generations, and then also how are we, if we really see policing as this system that is causing tremendous harm, are we replicating this within our own community and our own institutions? And what is our responsibility to be questioning that and challenging that and finding something different to do?
Yeah, and I want to uplift that final piece that you said is um, because without going into too many details, right now we're seeing, at least with the report that came out with the URJ and other things around, really think it has me thinking about the ways in which ethical concerns have come up within our community, and really wondering, do we actually have alternative methods to address the harm that's been done that isn't that we already see in the world that isn't actually helpful. So how do we what does that look like and how do we heal within our own community? That is not a question for you.
Like, good, because I don't have an I mean, that's kind of, I have the same question.
Yeah, but I mean, but that's why this is really why this question, and really why we talk about community safety beyond policing, because it's really, for me, it's really about how do we heal communities. And I also like that you said that that you talked about criminal justice reform as a natural next step, and I say that because oftentimes what I've observed post Black Lives Matter is not many people have a strong understanding of prison abolition
Mhm.
as a kicking off start for police abolition. That is not this episode, but because that's a much longer piece. But if you do have any thoughts or statements about prison abolition, or I don't know if you've read, assuming you have probably read a lot of things, but um, if you have any thoughts about that before I ask another question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my thought is a question, and this is one of, like, I apologize. I'm one of those people that often responds to things by asking more questions, but a lot of that is because, like, I'm an organizer and I don't always assume I have the answers. I feel that one of my jobs is to I mean, and like, and that's very Jewish, right? Like, I'm just going to ask some more questions. Um, we are a country, the United States incarcerates more people than any other country in the world, and yet we continue to look at incarcerating more people as the answer to how we solve crime. And I just feel like at some point perhaps it bears questioning whether maybe that's not working. Like, maybe that's not the answer. This has been happening recently, especially with youth on the north side, where there's crime. There was a story that came out last week about the way that gangs are using young people, and putting young people's bodies in danger because they really don't care. And we often look at, like, well, we need to incarcerate people younger, right? We need to incarcerate people younger and younger and younger. But we're not investing in other things that we could be doing with young people's lives to give them alternatives. I mean, like, it's not a coincidence for me that what used to be the biggest community center on the north side is now where the fourth precinct police station lives and exists. That we literally replaced youth investment with more policing. And so for me, at some point, just, if putting everyone in jail isn't solving crime, then I think we need to question, not just is putting more people in jail going to solve crime, but also, why are certain folks invested in more incarceration? Is it because they actually think that it's an answer to crime? Or is it because maybe they have an economic incentive to incarcerate people? Like, let's not pretend that the private prison industry isn't like a multi-billion-dollar industry,
Mhm.
that we're serving by incarcerating people. So that was a lot more questions.
Well, I mean, and those are good questions, right? It's I don't know how we get to the answers, and right, this the sense of younger and younger. Over the weekend, I'm not going to have the city, but over the weekend, I saw a report about a 4-year-old who the school district called the police on him, and it, it almost made no sense. It's at what point are we just? I mean, and I'm gonna name it. That gives a whole different understanding of the school to prison pipeline for a 4-year-old um, to have to deal with having the police called on them by their school
Mhm,
district, um, and also realizing that, especially the more and more I do these anti-black racism trainings, the more and more I hear stories about the ways in which younger students are being more and more criminalized, particularly black and brown
mhm.
ones as well as poor ones. And so just naming that has an impact. Um,
Yeah, and that in a time when, I mean, like literally there was a story that came out last week. Somebody said something to me this weekend about how, the left is constantly demonizing the police, and I just responded to them and said, I do not understand how anything could be more damning to the police than their own record at this point. There was this story that came out on Care 11 last week about how 1 in 3 training officers in MPD has significant disciplinary records, and that the police officers who have had the most disciplinary actions, instead of being let go, are being invited in to train younger, newer officers. And so I just continue to question again, like, why are we incarcerating so many people if that's clearly not working? I also don't get, I mean, the idea that you would call the police on a 4-year-old to me implies that you think police are the answer to the problem that you're having. And so for me, like, I understand there are situations where police may, at this point, for lack of any other option, that there are situations where police are the answer, right? For some people, I don't understand this notion that they're just like the first person that you call no matter what happens. Like there was this story a couple years ago about how like there was a bear running around downtown, and like people called the police. It's like, what do you like? The bear's not committing a crime. Like, I don't know. Maybe bears are doing the carjacking, but I'm sorry. It's a tasteless joke, but
I mean, but those are right. Those are really good questions and important things to think about. I mean, not the bear, clearly,
right.
but
This is
the
my
other
this
questions.
is this is me being very Jewish, Enzi. All I'm going to do is ask questions and then tell jokes to mask my discomfort.
That's okay. I'm okay with that. Oh, that's what I was
Mhm.
gonna say also though, which is kind of it's whatever. In the last episode 2 weeks ago, I gave the statistic, but um, I I've been doing a lot of research and really trying to figure out the history beyond what's in the. We have the history from the MPD 150, but I did some stats specifically on Minneapolis, and since 2000, Minneapolis Police Department had killed 37 citizens,
Mm.
and in that same time period, 3 Minneapolis police officers died in the line of duty. I said to say is that it is a very drastic a difference in reality. Um, and it comes to show one of the biggest things I really believe is we could tell about the way in which society is going to operate by the way in which we treat our children.
Mm.
And it is no secret that children on the north side, for example, uh, don't have the same opportunities always as children in other areas. And it's very fascinating what we're willing to sacrifice for our children. I'm always worried and concerned and paying attention to those things. If that makes sense, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, kids on the north side are just having a different reality and a different experience than kids in other parts of the city, and it's just true and real. I'll often see like friends will post on Facebook about they're like that their kids had a code red drill at school, and like, and I'm not going to deny that it's jarring and traumatic for kids to have those code red drills. And also, I'll tell you, like, my kids who go to north side schools have like legitimate code reds like once a month where there really is a shooting outside the building. And I tell you this not to to drum up outrage, but to say that like for Northside kids, this is very normal. They are nonplussed. When like my son will come home from high school and I'm like, there was a shooting by your bus stop, and he's just like, I mean, yeah, like it's I say this to only illustrate that there's a different reality that is very normalized for kids on the north side.
Yeah, I mean, and when you say that, it just reminds me of growing up in the '90s.
Mm-hmm.
That like that was just reality for at least for me in the area that I was at, and just thinking about the ways in which that changes your outlook in some very interesting ways. One of the things as we're talking about this, and we could go wherever we want to with this, but I've been really thinking about schooling as well as the ways in which while it's really important to be involved in local electoral politics, particularly within school districts and everything else, um, really because it appears that there's a lot of laws or procedures or different things that are put in place from the very localized level. that has a drastic impact on us. So, for example, the Charter Amendment and all these small things of how do we utilize the tools that we have, whatever that means. Tools assume that there's a right way, and I'm not going to assume that, but how do we use what we have to make a bigger difference? Particularly when I see at times, and I'm not as keen on this, but as I begin to pay more and more attention, particularly post the census, right? Paying attention to what and how the small local politics can make a huge difference in the outcomes and the realities of this. And I don't know, I could be wrong also. So just naming that. So this next question is, I'm just really jumping over. I'm so sorry.
No, what? You're
Okay,
fine.
good. All right. So this next question, and I'm actually, if it's okay, would love for you to to talk a little bit about the I want to say essay, but the article you wrote, was it in the Pollen?
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
I would love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So Pollen had reached out. Pollen is a really excellent publication here in the Twin Cities. And they had reached out because they were doing a series about like narratives and truth versus public narrative and changing narratives. And it was a pretty open-ended, like what to write about. And it happened at the time when I was really like, I was noodling on this thing that was happening as part of the campaign for the charter amendment. So yes, for Minneapolis. This was a and it was not necessarily about the policy piece of the campaign, but it was that this was a really multiracial coalition that really spent a lot of time building relationships and trust among participants. Like, people will ask me about the charter amendment. I'm like, we didn't win, but all of this really great stuff happened. And a bunch of that stuff was about the work that a bunch of different communities did to really build relationships and to organize together. And the thing that kept coming up for a lot of the staff people in the coalition was how when you are part of a marginalized community and you start talking about the idea of alternatives to police or ways of doing community safety differently, your community starts to perceive you as the threat. There were people who were very angry, people within the Jewish community who were pretty angry that they saw me as advocating to take away their safety. And so I just started thinking about that. I started thinking about, like, what does it feel like to be in a community that and it's not just about community safety or policing, it's any time you are pushing your community to do something transformational or different or scary. Like, I want to identify, like, doing new things that we've not done before is like new and scary. Like, that's just, it's not a bug. It's just, it like part of pushing into something new is that this is scary. And, it's your body's way of saying this is new territory. We've not been here before. And so I don't deny that it's scary. I just don't think it's necessarily scary because it's wrong. I think it's scary because it's new. And so I started thinking about that. And then I decided I wanted to approach it rather than from the negative of, well, when you try to push people to do something new, then they get mad at you, and to push towards this positive framing of what could be possible if we opened ourselves up to that discomfort and to imagining something different. And so I ended up just writing this essay. It was really different because normally what I write is very like aggressive. Like normally I write like speeches, right? But this was much more like an invitation to imagine something together. It was a really I feel very grateful to have been given that assignment. And it was true that after it was published, a bunch of folks from other communities were like, yes, this resonates completely for me. But it was really about pushing ourselves to ask, like, when we really take a minute to think about safety and what safety means, what does that mean, right? Like, if I close my eyes and imagine a time when I feel the most safest and secure, what are the conditions that are giving me those feelings? And how can you replicate those conditions in different ways, and also in ways that don't harm other people? So that's kind of what that was about.
Oh, thank you. I think that is really, I think I really appreciated that framing, and it actually leads to the next question, and really thinking about, if you were to envision a future in which we win, what does that future look like for you? And if
Oh,
that question doesn't make sense, let me know.
no, it just, I mean, it's very specific. And I don't know that I don't know that my imagination is that detailed. at all, because I think part of it is that the framework that we're all imagining in is about this absence, right? If
Hmm.
we
Hmm.
win, something goes away, and we've not really been given the room or the resources to dream about what comes in its place. I mean, organizations like MPD 150 like are doing all of that great imaginative work, and I feel like I haven't allowed myself to step too far into that space yet. But I will tell you, I do think that like one of the things that I imagine is, is like what youth investment could look like in places like North Minneapolis if we weren't just putting money into not just policing but also like the programming that we invite youth to join into is always about either getting a job or like what if we gave youth the investment and resources and space to first of all like design their own programming.
Hmm.
What if we made sure that those spaces were run by people who look like youth and come from those communities? And what if they weren't grounded in the need to like be a productive like money earning member of society, right? Like what if I think the step up program is probably great, but it really is about like youth getting jobs. Like
Hmm.
what if we, gave youth a stipend to do art?
Hmm.
Like so, and I know that sounds like, oh, hippy dippy, not to you, but to like some people. But I just would reiterate that like the things that we're doing are not working.
Hmm.
And so maybe it is time to spend some time and money on imagining just possibilities of new things.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. Two things. One of my favorite sweatshirts that I have, um, hoodies is a hoodie that says abolition is creative,
Hmm.
because it takes a really huge creative mind to kind of dream or envision. And I also go back to what it was like in my childhood growing up in the '90s. Really, particularly thinking of it in the height of the crack epidemic, the height of just constant violence. Um, and really thinking about the programs we had in place. We had something called Mayor's Night Hoops, and so it was a program of a basketball league that Emmanuel Cleaver, the first Black mayor of Kansas City, started. We also had Hot Summer Nights, which was a club type thing for teenagers and younger. And then all of a sudden, 94, 95 hits. They're all taken away and replaced with policing and
Hmm.
more policing, and just realize that the drastic difference in taking away the ability to do things not just in a way to be quote unquote productive, but to do things that are fun and regenerative and life giving. Um, because our youth barely get to live a youthful life,
Hmm.
and so it seems really cruel in some ways for the only opportunities they get is to be working, working, and working.
Yeah.
Um, and so just that's legitimate, and it's a lot. Um, and also I appreciate the reality of it is hard sometimes to envision what could be new or different because we see it very much in a deficit,
Hmm.
and we really it is hard to figure out how do we move from a scarcity mindset with particularly with community safety into a mindset of abundance, because I do think we have the tools or resources that we need and we've never seen it.
Right.
And so how do we envision something that we have never seen?
Yeah.
Um,
The thing that I would just add is like, I mean, I'm in my mid 40s. Like, I have a teenager. I guarantee my teenager has some ideas and some vision for like what could be different and what could be new. And so I do also think that part of this problem is we're grounding a lot of this conversation in, like minds that for whom it's harder to envision something new and different.
mhm.
And so I think I continue to go back to investing in youth. So
I think that's important.
yeah.
I mean, look, I don't have any children, and I very much pay extreme close attention to as much as I can to this to the school district, what's happening with our students and with our youth in general, because we need them.
Mhm.
And also, I'm aware that I don't see myself as old, and I know that like I'm older,
Yeah.
and the things that youth are doing, like I started to realize this week. I'm like, oh no, I haven't done things with youth for 15 years, and I as a youth, I haven't worked with youth in a very long time, and so really just thinking about that. So I do agree that the youth are they're not just our future.
Yeah.
They're our present, and they're going to be able to get us to places that we could never imagine being. Um, if so, I guess the really one of the very final questions I have is there anything else that you would like to share or that I might be forgetting?
I think you wanted to talk a little bit about some of the questions that I had been posing last year about like what it means for our identity as a Jewish community to talk about community
Yes,
safety. Is that right?
yes. Thank you for. I was trying to find that question. I'm like, did so I didn't copy and paste it onto my thing. But
Yeah.
yes, I would love to, like, really, I don't remember exactly what you said, but thinking about it in a sense of like, what does it look like for a community who have experienced state sanctioned violence, to depend on the state for our safety? And so,
Yeah.
um,
This is a conversation, you know, I'm not even sure I was having a conversation with like a colleague in the Jewish community last year about anti-Semitism and about how some of the community groups that we work with on issues of state violence, whether it's policing or immigration or incarceration, um, view anti-Semitism. And at the time I said, well, and whether it's a priority for them. I will say that like my experience has been that other communities are very eager to learn about anti-Semitism, and to be able to be stronger partners to the Jewish community. But I was talking to my colleague and I said, I think part of the thing that's hard is that like some communities are literally fighting for their lives out here. And I don't know that we are in the same way. Um, and um, and part of what's baked into that is that the violence that the Jewish community has been experiencing in the United States has been largely the work of individuals. I mean, and not just individuals. I would argue that there's actually a white nationalist movement that is targeting us. It often gets reported as like lone wolves, but there is actually, and I recommend, Enzi, if you read this book, A Field Guide to White Supremacy, there's actually a great chapter in it about the way that often white nationalist terrorists are reported as lone wolves, when in fact there's an entire network of organizing happening. But the difference is that we are experiencing, and we are experiencing real violence, and there are other communities who are experiencing violence at the hands of the state. And I think the place where that for me brings up a lot more questions is about Jewish identity, and our Jewish community's identity, right? And so yeah, I mean, for me, we're a community that has this identity that is based partly, at least, in the fact that we've been the targets of state violence for literally centuries. Many of us are often called to remind people, like there's this use of the Holocaust and the Nazis to mean any minor inconvenience. It's like, it's wild, it's painful, it's inappropriate, but it also I want to identify that Hitler was the elected leader of Germany, and that this in fact was the state, and that it was the military and the police who carried it out, and so and that was like the most recent example that many people in our community have. And so we're this community that has this tremendous history and legacy of being targeted by the state, whether it's pogroms, whether it's crusades, right? And are we moving into a place in our community's history of identity? And I just mean this in the way that we know ourselves and think of ourselves. Are we in this place where we no longer see the state as our oppressor? We see, white nationalist groups or fringe operators as our oppressor, and rather the state is now our protector. The state is who we call when we're afraid. And for me, and if that's the case, then let's explore what that means, right? Like, is that what we're saying? Is that at this point in history, the state is actually the protector of Jews? Because if that's the case, what does that mean? A, for how we think about ourselves in terms of power and access. And also, what does it mean for our ability to be in solidarity with people who are targeted by the state, right? And so if we're saying, actually, the police are who we rely on to protect us, if we know that the presence of police puts other people in danger, are we at that point making a trade where we're willing to say, as historically oppressed people, we're willing to privilege our safety or our perception of safety over the safety of others. And so for me, it's this question of identity. Like, how do we see ourselves as marginalized people in context alongside and living among other marginalized people?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, this brings up some really lots of really good points. One of the things that I'm just really thinking about is, and I have no clue, and this potentially whether with you or someone else could be a whole different podcast on a different day, but just really thinking about the ways in which, um, really thinking about the rebellions of the 1960s,
Mm.
between 1965 and 72, particularly, many of those areas that saw uh, uprisings and rebellions were the areas that at one point or at that time period were uh, Black and Jewish communities, and seeing how, um, I have no clue. This is just like a thought in my brain and pondering is that the moment where, uh, as a community, we saw the state and policing as our protectors if they were the ones who came in and
Mm-hmm.
protected um, the shops or whatever, and just being aware of the way history happens, as well as the way history is intentionally erased to make us not understand the ways in which things operate together. If that makes sense.
I think it makes a ton of sense. I think these are related questions. I mean, it's another, if like when you talk about how during civil rights, often these were Black and Jewish areas, and there was a tremendous amount of tension between those two communities. And the police are coming in to protect one of those communities
Hmm.
at the great, physical detriment to the other community. But it's also related to the very story of like the way that of the role of the Jewish community in, let's say, white flight, right? That
Hmm.
I often think about the way that I often think about the way the Jewish community thinks of the North Side as
Hmm.
like the before in a before and after story, right? The North Side, like with, I often think about it from the perspective of how it limits our community's ability to understand the North Side as a place where other communities are intentionally building generational
Hmm.
connections and wealth and power, whereas for us, we were able to do that like as we left. But
Hmm.
I often think about the role of like how in order for some communities to have a story of mobility and success, there is a cost to other
Hmm.
communities, right? And so as Jewish families left the North Side and moved their businesses with them, they didn't do this to target the Black community. They did this for their own mobility and their own betterment. And the side effect of that was profound disinvestment in places that had been business corridors on the North Side. And so, like, similarly, it reminds me of the James Baldwin article where he talks about if we seem anti-Jewish, it's because we're watching Jewish people choose whiteness.
Yeah,
um,
the one that says the Negro is anti-Semitic because we're anti-white.
Yeah, and it's really identifying that the Jewish community is making this trade where we're choosing either economic success or security or safety, and it's by making this bargain that has a lot to do with whiteness, right? And so
Hmm.
I think about, like, yeah, similar. I mean, it does relate for me to what you said, especially about civil rights, because there is also this question of not just how the police came in and protected one of those communities, but also that, so it wasn't just that the Jewish community might be choosing security in a way that was harmful to their neighbors. It's also about the way that, our very pursuit of this quiet, like, suburban life where, we were able to escape poverty also, like, came at the detriment of maybe some other folks in the community.
Hmm.
I don't think these are things that are like intentionally done, like
Hmm.
and I want to make that clear. This is like, I say, like, I organize Jews because, like, this is my community and I love my community. Like, I think that, I say this like with a profound amount of like self-reflection about my role, my
Hmm.
family's role and stuff like this too. But I do think there are all kinds of ways that as communities seek something better for themselves, it
Hmm.
causes harm to other communities,
And
and we should be thinking about it.
sometimes I hate to say it, sometimes it actually is intentional. And this would be a whole other episode for a different day. But in the Twin Cities, uh, Jewish folks, there was racial covenants that prevented Jewish folks and Black folks from living in certain areas. When Jewish folks were able to live in those areas, many of the covenants, many of the deeds included, they added in racial covenants for Black folks.
Mhm.
And so in those ways, that's intentional. And that's not that's not the norm, right? But naming how in which we do have this complex history on a lot of levels, and um, how do we reflect upon what's happening as a way to move us forward? You know,
Right. Right.
I constantly am aware of that. Scary movies makes us scared. We know it's not happening.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and also not just like take this information and figure out not how to get stuck in it, but how to move forward, but also like, and who benefits from this, right? Like, it wasn't just that like the Jewish community and Black community woke up one day in places like Detroit or Boston or North Minneapolis and were like, let's fight, right? Like, there were key policy decisions and institutional decisions that benefited, and people who benefited from pitting these two marginalized communities against each other, they're still doing it. And so for me, it's always this question of like, who's benefiting? Like, when people are fighting with each other, is there somebody who's benefiting? And why are we not standing together and looking over at that person?
Right.
Or not person, but you understand what I'm saying. Yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a whole lot of sense. All right, Carin. This was such a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to being able to do this again, on a different topic or whatever. And again, thank you so much for joining us on Kumba Hineni. Kumba Hineni, a podcast on intersectionality, more than just getting deep, is a part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network, a product of Jew Folk Inc. You can email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com/podcast.